Yes, today I'm going to be discussing government spending and recent events, what Trump's re-election, has to do with it, how it's going to affect it. Hopefully, it won't be too confusing. Um, I'm going based off of an article that I chose. But before we get to it, I want to get some key terminology out of the way. I know that you guys know most of these, but just to lock it down, just so we don't have confusion about what I'm talking about. So one thing I'm going to be mentioning is an inflationary gap. It's basically when the economy is working overtime. You only have so many people, you only have so many factories, and it's not able to, work 50, 60 hours a week every week. It's going to put pressure on prices. Basically, it's when the equilibrium is to the right of the aggregate supply. Yes, aggregate supply line. Yes, basically, it causes inflation. It's not sustainable. That's the only thing that we should really know for now. A monetary policy. It is in the United States. A monetary policy is the Federal Reserve's regulation of monetary supply. Basically, their control of rates, their control of how much money is in circulation. There are many ways by which they do that. How much money banks are supposed to keep in reserve. All you should know is that it's the Federal Reserve. In any other country, it's called the central bank, and most of the time, it is the government. But in the United States, it's a bit different. It's not the government; it's the Federal Reserve, and they have their own ways of controlling things. And then there's the fiscal policy. That's the government's doing things. That is how much money they borrow. It's their taxes. It is how they spend their money. And lastly, an expansionary policy. So I wrote that it's a monetary policy aimed at stimulating growth. But as I worked on this presentation, I realized that an expansionary policy doesn't have to be monetary. It can be a fiscal policy. The government can enact policies that encourage growth, as we can see here. So all you have to know is that an expansionary policy is a policy aimed at basically speeding up the economy. So the article in question is Trump's election victory puts Fed on a path for fewer cut rates. The article is pretty confusing. I'm going to break it down really quick so that you don't have to read it. You can if you want. I'm going to cite it later. Basically, before Trump's election, the Federal Reserve was on a path to cutting rates, so an expansionary policy. And after Trump got reelected, so the sources say that in response to Trump's reelection, the Federal Reserve it slowed down its rate cutting. So it's still in the path for expansion, an expansionary policy, but it's not as quick to do so or decrease the expansion, I guess. And you're wondering why the heck does that happen? So an expansionary monetary policy, the Federal Reserve is cutting rates. It's slowing down, it's cutting them nonetheless. As a response to Trump's reelection, the rate cut has slowed down. It hasn't stopped, but we can see a kind of a cause and effect here, and we'll discuss it later. Why do they do this, and what this means for government spending? Because you have an expansionary policy on one side, and then a contractionary on the other. And then what does Trump seek to do in his newly elected government? Yeah. So you might say, why not have an expansionary policy? Boost the economy, make everybody happy, everybody gets rich. This is why. So what happens first is you increase the money supply, you make borrowing money cheaper, you increase stimulus demand, you also incentivize the government to spend more. Increases aggregate demand, which causes an inflationary gap. Or if you achieve your goal, you're going to get an inflationary gap because, as I said, you only have so many people, so many factories. You can only produce so much before prices go up due to inflationary pressures. And what happens is you devalue the national debt in the future. You're projected to do so. So I'll quickly explain. So we know that the United States is like $30-something trillion in debt. And how do they plan to work with it? Well, they don't really plan to pay it off. At least they don't have to. They just wait for inflation to eat at it slowly. And inflation now means the debt you owe is going to be worth less in the future. So that just encourages you to borrow now because you'll owe less later than you would have, if that makes sense. And I hope it does. So that is why you need to control your expansionary tendencies on both sides. So what is Trump's policy that caused the Federal Reserve to cut rates? So he wants to enact tariffs on imports, which alone might have inflationary pressures driving prices up. He seeks to stop importing energy, which is also more exports, less imports. It's not so straightforward. It might seem amazing, but there are going to be drawbacks that we're going to talk about. But Trump also seeks to cut government spending, which it's strange looking at it from the Keynesian perspective. If you want to stimulate the economy, you want to spend more money, increase aggregate demand. But here, Trump problem is not only to control inflation and to cut government spending, which I guess that would work, but to boost the economy. I mean, it's quite a goal. So we're going to look at it on the surface level. So what do we see here? The Federal Reserve, it slows down its expansionary policy, but it has one nonetheless, an expansionary policy, cutting rates. It still seeks to stimulate the economy, and that would encourage inflation, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but that is what you'd expect. The new government, on the other hand, their goal is to cut spending. So is that a contractionary policy? Possibly. And yet they seek to stimulate the economy. Well, the question is how. Maybe they seek to, contract and expand later. I don't know. Um, all you need to know is that these are difficult goals to achieve simultaneously. It's not impossible, but it's difficult. And Trump also promises to curb or even to reverse inflation, which that would be amazing, but it's quite a goal. He's shooting for the moon. So if we look at it closely from a more, I guess, economic perspective, what do we see here? The Federal Reserve wants to increase the money supply. It does want to do so regardless of Trump or Kamala. They want to do it anyway. They want to stimulate the economy by doing so, which, if we look at it from the Keynesian perspective, it's a short-term response to a recession or a slow economy. And it also allows for liquidity, more money, more room for private investors or, I guess, private firms to work with the money and invest in it, do what they will. On the other hand, we have a government, a newly elected government, mostly, who seeks to uh, reduce government spending, which is going to reduce aggregate demand according to the Keynesian framework. But they also seek for this. They also seek to achieve fiscal responsibility. Less government spending is a more sustainable way of running a government, I guess, which is a neoclassical framework. They're looking at it in the long term. I guess, uh, yeah, you see why this is confusing, but I'm explaining this all. So if we look at it from the economic perspective, cutting rates, uh, basically giving the private sector more room to invest. It's plus GDP because, as we know, investment is a component of GDP. Nonetheless, you also develop domestic industry by importing tariffs. I'm sorry, in enacting tariffs. More exports, less imports. Exports minus imports equals contribution to GDP, as we also learned. And you reduce budget deficit, if not eliminate it at all, which hasn't been done in like 23 years. But I guess that would be reducing the budget deficit alone is a good goal, which is plus GDP because you have less. Actually, no, it's not so simple. No. Okay, forget the last line. It's not gonna be relevant. We're not gonna need it. It's not even correct. Okay, but there's the other side of things. Everything sounds amazing, but it's not. It's not short. If it was so easy, they would have done it a while ago. So here's where it gets complicated. Reducing aggregate demand, you decrease growth. According to the Keynesian framework, we have to cut government spending. That might slow down the economy, and actually probably will do so. Tariffs are going to put pressure on inflation because prices go up. Domestic is more expensive than imported. That is why we import. It might be a good goal, but there might be drawbacks. And lastly, the tariffs, which are as serious as they might have international consequences. Who knows what kind of consequences those might have. So I hope I explained the complexity of the situation, and I hope I clarified it. I can't tell you what to expect, but this is just my picking apart of the article based on what we learned in class. Hopefully, I was able to use that knowledge properly. And thank you for watching.